Okay, the crucifixion of Jesus is a separate item to discuss. It's such a significant part of the Christian story in the life of Jesus that the textbook dedicates a separate chapter to it, and we will look at it in this session. So let's pull up our PowerPoint, take a look at that. All right, so here we go. Crucifixion. So this is the culmination of what we call the Passion story. And really at a turning point in the Gospels, Jesus starts to share with his students, his disciples, that he's going to suffer, that he's going to suffer and die. As soon as they figure out who he is, he says, "Who do y'all say that I am?" He then discloses, this is not going to have the ending that you wanted to have. He says, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the leaders, the religious leaders, and be killed. But he says, on the third day, be raised. Now, the Jewish people had a concept of resurrection at the very end of human history, not to be raised and defeat death here. They figured everybody had to die. And so that definitely is what's going on. So Jesus actually picks up that story of suffering even more so when they have the final Passover celebration, and he takes the disciples to a special place called the Garden of Gethsemane. Now today, you see this picture here, it looks real peaceful, but it would have been packed because during the celebration of Passover, there would have been so many pilgrims in Jerusalem that the city would have swollen up like 2 or 3 times its normal size. In fact, they would call in some of the troops, some of the additional leaders from other provinces to come and help maintaining the Pax Romana, maintaining the peace. But you see olive trees here. This is a garden with huge trees. So that reminds us of that setting at the time. And it's here where he prays with the disciples. And so it talks about it. He says, he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And so he says, pray that y'all may not come into the time of trial. And then it says he withdraws from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed. And in our Western understanding, when somebody withdraws from a group, and we see this often portrayed in movies as well and in pieces of art, we think about solitude. We think that we withdraw by ourselves. Well, I don't know about you, but some of you have lived elsewhere. I've lived in Southeast Asia in a place that was really just overpopulated, but also it was collective in its understanding of doing community. People just simply were never alone. So when you would withdraw from one group, you would automatically be among other people. And so I don't think that Jesus at this point was by himself. He was just away from his group. And remember, it's Passover. So the city is so full of people. That park, that garden would have been full of people camping out there. They came there to stay for a long time, possibly stay all the way through Pentecost. So it is not eerie quiet. There's people all around. He is just away from them, leaving them to themselves, and he is away over there. So when he comes back to his group and group, he asks them, why are y'all sleeping? And the question is interesting, right? Because, there's some people that would say, wouldn't Jesus know what's going on? But it's a question for the people who received this text. It's for them. And why is it for them? Well, it's because of the timing of the question. This is Passover. And at any other time of Passover, the people would not have been asleep. I mean, this was an exciting night. This was the night that the kids were allowed to stay up. And the patriarchs of the family would tell the story of Passover, of Pascha, where they commemorated that God led the people out of Egypt in haste. He let them out, and they would tell the stories, and they would sing the songs, and the kids would be excited to stay up late. It's like staying up on New Year's Eve. You don't go to sleep. So any other night, they would have stayed up and would have celebrated that God redeemed them, let them out of this huge predicament. And this night, the irony of it is that Jesus is about to lead humanity out of the biggest predicament of human history, their entrapment in their predicament of this community not being restored. And they go to sleep. And he says, get up and pray. The young men have come into this hour of trial. And they keep going back to sleep. And then Judas shows up and he betrays him with a kiss. And the contrast. Normally you would kiss people because you're at a party. And here it's the kiss of betrayal. So then Jesus is taken, everybody else fled, and the trial follows. And then the trial is really messy. It's messy. There's a trial before religious authorities, but there's a whole lot of different opinions on the fact that they even had some jurisdiction. They really don't. Then he goes to the Roman authorities. And in the end, they really just don't want trouble. They really just don't. There's too many people there. And so they try to relegate that and try to be smart and maybe just get somebody else that they would let go. And it's not working. And the religious people really just want to get rid of Jesus. And so they shout, crucify him. Well, that's kind of drastic. It's a lot of work too. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas to them. The plan kind of failed. And so he flogs Jesus and he hands them over. And look at that handing over part. First of all, look here. There's one of these pillars flogging. We often focus on that in these movies and portrayals, and it's kind of sad that it's probably not the pillar where he was flogged at. But if there's a flogging stone, that meant that people had been flogged there. So regardless, people had suffered at that. But look at the account in Matthew 27. So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed them over. But this is what happens with the handing over part. And more people have looked into this. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters. There's like no reason for that. And then they have their way with him. They gathered the whole cohort around him. They're messing with him. And then it says this, they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And then they put these thorns in a crown, and they put it on his head. They put a reed in his hand, and they knelt before him and mocked him. So there's more and more research that indicates that stuff is left out of here because it is assumed. We don't learn how they take him in there. We assume that they drag him. That's always portrayed in movies. We assume that. We know from history that they crucified people nakedly. They don't have a loincloth. That is for our puritanical sensibilities. They crucified them naked, with bodily fluids running down. And so other parts are not told. They were not told they crucified naked. That's simply what they did. What they also may have done is they may have assaulted people. And so I apologize if this is a very sensitive area for you. But more and more research is being done that the stripping down may have a stronger connotation there of what happened to Jesus. That also means that Jesus can identify with a lot of human suffering. That's what happened to Jesus. And then they mock him some more. They spit on him, they mock him, they stripped him of the robe and then put his own clothes on him. Why would you have to strip people and put his clothes back on? See, in Christianity, we make a big deal about somebody spitting on him. Well, that doesn't equal the pain that humanity goes through. More and more people think that Jesus can absolutely identify with the abused. I'll leave you to that. So then Jesus, who can barely walk for various reasons, has to carry the cross. And he can barely carry it. Now we know why he might not be able to carry the cross. And it says they compel a passerby to carry his cross. And then look, this is written to the Christians in Rome. It said they grabbed Simon of Cyrene. And so Cyrene is in North Africa, it's current-day Libya. And so this African father apparently has two sons, because it says the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, the Gospel of Mark is the shortest gospel. And if you have to spend any kind of space on that, why would you drop names of sons? Well, because it's very interesting. Because in a later letter in the New Testament, ironically, it's not really written later, but we place it later, there's actually a greeting to Rufus. And so some people have said, maybe the audience the people to whom this was written, maybe they knew Alexander and Rufus. And so it's kind of like, if you want to know more about the crucifixion, they were there. You can ask them. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. And then the crucifixion takes place, 9 o'clock in the morning. And they crucified him. Ironically, when we get to the book of Acts, 9 o'clock in the morning, when the signs and wonders start. But here's the question. Why did Jesus die? Does it ever puzzle you? Why was death the way? Why does somebody have to die in order to satisfy something? Well, what is it all about? So people have really been thinking about this. And it's not an easy answer, right? So here you see some pictures. These are actually the doggies of my brother in Canada. 2 of them have since passed away. So I grew up in the Netherlands and did not grow up with the gospel until I was much older. And then some American missionaries came to this church in the Netherlands where I was at, and they shared the gospel. But remember, God meets people where they are, but we don't always meet people where they are. And I think that's where we kind of miss each other. And so this idea of why did Jesus die, needs to be really just considered in light of, how do people process that, right? So this church, I'm forever grateful for this church and the people there. But the church leaders, because they came from America, they were trained with an American perspective, coming to small town. Well, this was a big town actually, but a small neighborhood in the Netherlands. And so in America, there's often the story, well, people have sinned, and because you've sinned, somebody has to die, and Jesus did that. And it's and then, of course, then, if we can ask an honest question, it is, so people did some bad things and therefore somebody else has to die? And that's like amazing when you really think about it. At some point, that kind of, would it even work? Like somebody is about to be condemned for something, and if somebody else walks into the courtroom and says, that's all right, I got it. That's not how we do justice, right? Apart from that, what does that even mean? And so then they would explain that in that church. It's like, well, and they would go to the Old Testament story, the first part of the story, where they would explain the Jewish religious system, where they would sacrifice animals. They would slit animals' throats in exchange for people being let go, being forgiven of their wrongs. And so they kind of mix the two together, say, well, Jesus died because he dies instead of those animals in the Jewish religious system. So they told that story. Well, back to my brother, when they told the story that they would sacrifice these perfect little lambs, and that Jesus now came in instead of being happy that Jesus now instead was being slaughtered, and therefore, my brother was now free to be with God again, my brother was just repulsed, because a lot of people in the Netherlands are animal friends or animal fanatics. And to make matters worse, look at this. His donkeys are white little donkeys. They look like little lambs. And all he could say was, why would God even do that in the first place? Why would God want a perfect little animal to have his throat slit? Why a bloodbath? Because God gets upset because people don't like him? He was just repulsed. He had just no interest. I don't mean this in a blasphemous sort of way, but it is interesting, is it not? He did not relate to that. Now, he was a kind person, and he would go to church for the sake of his wife, but never connected with him. So here are some different ways, actually, that the Bible talks about the reason why Jesus died. It actually says in one of those letters, there's lots of letters in the New Testament. In one way, it says, actually, Jesus actually died because he won a battle over evil. That's actually why he died. Or they said, actually, Jesus died because he's an example of what God's love was all about. There's the one where he dies to serve as a sacrifice, the little lamb story. He died to pay a ransom. People in church history past have talked about that one. Like, well, who do you pay the money to? He died to take the place of others. That's kind of in there, right? You go up to the court case and you go like, no, that's, I'll take it. To bring satisfaction for dishonor. This is something that sometimes in Africa or in Asia is big. It's like, we have like dishonored God, and now somebody got to pay the price for that. Somebody has to satisfy that to bring about reconciliation. Now, I got to say, as a European, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. If you come from a country that lived through World War II, you want to see countries reconciled. That's very interesting. I was always drawn to that one. So there's lots of them, right? Forgiveness of sins, enter the holy places, to bring peace, victory over sin and darkness and death, to bring abundant life, shame, purpose, acceptance, to redeem creation, to provide a sense of belonging. But it is difficult, right? Because people would still look at the right side and say, okay, so if you have all that to bring a sense of belonging, well, why did Jesus have to die for that? So these are very difficult theological concepts. And we got to watch out, when we meet people where they are, because it's often colloquial thinking, right? And people come up and say, oh, I'm here to tell you the good news. Now imagine, I didn't grow up Christian, right? And go like, okay, so what's the good news? It's like, well, first let me tell you, you're a dirty, rotten sinner. You deserve to die and go to hell. You're like, well, that's not good news, people. I mean, it's like, I've never been so depressed in my life. My life was really good before I met you. I'm like, yeah. No, but it's really good news because Jesus died for you. I'm like, I know, but I mean, that's like the worst news ever. That's not good news. Why is that good news? So it's hard to meet people where they are. And so if it is about God giving me a sense of belonging because I can be part of a community, oh, that one is it for me. That's the one that was it for me. Now, why did Jesus have to die in order to establish that? Do you see that these things of Christianity are really hard, actually? So we think about these things. At the end of the day, Drain says, right, the writer of a textbook, these are all analogies. These are all ways for our finite human brain to approximate the things of God. All we know is Jesus died. Maybe the big news is he didn't stay dead. He did not. So here's a concept that we deal with in missions and intercultural studies. We call it the 4D gospel. In order to meet people where they are, we need to know where they are in their way of approaching the worldview. So that tends to be typical for typical locations. So typically in the West, it says Northern America. Some people lump Europe in there. And as a European, I'm not really on board with that, but that's okay. It says, there's often a guilt innocence culture. Like America is kind of like a guilt culture. Ever since we're little, we always feel guilty about everything. Have you ever noticed that? Guilty. I don't really have that. And so we tell people that they're guilty and they're separated from God. So somebody got to pay for that. I don't know why, but they have to pay for that, right? And or somebody can take its place, a substitute. It's kind of this idea of a courtroom and justice. That's why our courtroom dramas do so well on television. So what's another way to view it? Well, you can view it through the eyes of honor and shame. This is popular in the East. People's dilemma is they're shamed because they confronted Jesus' honor. So the solution is to restore honor and feel cleansed. And I think sometimes I think that college students feel attracted to that. They think, yeah, I sense shame. But I think it's a convoluted concept because I think it's actually not shame. I think it's still that guilt. We make people feel guilty about the things they've done. And then we load shame on them. But it's not the same because it doesn't really restore by restoring honor. We restore it by giving them dignity. Very different. I think it's still the guilt innocence. We say like, oh, you're not pure anymore. So it's not the same. Because the idea is that you restore a relationship. The relationship is not restored. We bring people into courtrooms and tell them they're second-rate citizens. So that's really not what it is. Fear and power. Yeah, we see that a lot in other areas where people feel that they're in bondage and they need deliverance and they desire freedom for stuff. But you see this with addictions as well. I see that more and more. And then there's one I think is very interesting. This idea of people are just kind of indifferent. Maybe you sit here and watch this, you go like, all this stuff, I'm just indifferent. I just don't care. But I do want to belong to something that's bigger than me. I want to be a part of something. I want to have a sense of purpose. Well, that's people that belong to a post-Christian era. The problem is people are just indifferent and they just don't care. But they do want to belong to something and they find purpose in that. It's more this idea of coming home, having a sense of community. I think we long for that. Well, all these four models really required a different way of looking at the same Jesus story. And I invite you to think about that. Well, in the Gospel of John, there's actually an interesting verse there where it explains what happens when Jesus does get crucified. Crucifixion means you hang people up on a piece of wood and you let them expire. People can only pull up for so long before the dioxide just kind of, carbon monoxide just kind of builds up and you suffocate. There's a metabolic issue. The story says, when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It's very interesting here when you read the Greek. That phrase, "it is finished," is actually one Greek word, tetelestai. I think that word sums it all up. If you ever want a tattoo, that's it, tetelestai. Greek actually expresses stuff by putting things at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. We call it inflection. And by the way that this is inflected, we can tell how this is intended. If you look it up in a dictionary, it will be the word telos in a noun form, and something like teleo or something in a verb form. But because of the way the beginning of the word works and the end, we can tell that this is a passive perfect. This is a perfective form. We have it in English as well, something that was completed in the past. It's done by something else, by someone or something else, because it's a passive form. We can tell who does it. That ending "tai" means that it is finished. And so the translation, it's kind of an archaic translation. It's better to say, it has been finished because something else did it. But there's something unique here in the way that this verb form pans out, because this is what we call a passive perfect passive, in that kind of form aims at an action that was completed in the past, but it has ongoing consequences. It's not just about something that was completed in the past, it's done, it has ongoing consequences. So whatever the "it" is, it could be the crucifixion, it could be Jesus's mission. His mission was to proclaim that new community, to inaugurate its restoration, that we as a people can live together, that we can actually have equity, that we can actually be a people that build up and not tear down, that we can go back to Act 1. That is finished. That's why he said, okay, I'd rather be killed than diminish that mission. It is finished. But that's not all. There's ongoing consequences. And I believe, it's just a personal belief, you don't have to agree with me, but I believe that part of the consequences that flow from that cross is because his mission was finished. We now know what the ultimate community is supposed to look like. That grace flows from that cross. The moment Jesus said that, grace started to flow, that you can come into that community and be restored no matter what. And that grace still flows. You're watching that today, that grace still flows for you. You can absorb that grace. The action is, there's nothing to be added to Jesus's mission. So I don't believe there's going to be an end-time battle. I don't believe that some Satan has to be defeated. I don't live my life in fear of that. I can live it with my head held up high because of tetelestai. I believe we've been taken over. We have taken over that mission. We've been given that mission, but it's a joy to carry that out. I don't have to work for it, but I have the privilege to walk in that grace. Tetelestai. I think it's incredible. In early Christian art, then people started to venerate crucifixion as a symbol. We have early commentators who talk about the different modes of crucifixion. It was not at all something that was reserved for Jesus. Crucifixion always took place. So the death of Jesus is not unique because of crucifixion. People were crucified all the time. It was not unique because it was unique suffering. People suffered all the time in crucifixion. In fact, we see here that some of them were crucified with the head down, with their private parts impaled. I told you, it's horrible the way they crucified. So that's not it. It's not because Jesus somehow died young. Jesus did not die young. The life expectancy was brief. That's not it. So what is it that made the death of Jesus unique? That's the question. I think it is the resurrection that followed. Look, thousands were crucified. The crucifixion was meant to be shock and awe, for people to stop messing around. It was reserved for slaves and insurrectionists, people that were perceived to rise up against the Roman Empire. It often happened on a tree, and those who died on a tree were perceived to be a curse. Jesus did not die as like a glorious divine warrior. He died as if he were a curse. We don't have much proof of of crucifixion, but they did find in the 60s, they find a heel bone, and they found the small things ever since. It's called a calcaneum. This is a model, this is the real thing. You have a video that you will watch with a nail in there and a little washer, which helps us to somehow reconstruct how they were crucified. Of course, people were crucified in so many different ways. This is one of the many things. They actually found that in an area near Jerusalem. Then there's always the question, where did it take place? Well, some said, maybe this idea of Golgotha, the place of the skull, reminded them of this place. You can maybe see a skull in there, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Maybe. I don't think that's the place, and many scholars with me don't think so, because it's outside of the area where they think it could have been. This is a place inside a church today that location-wise makes more sense. Now, of course, as soon as it comes under the care of the church, it's more about commemoration than it is about the preservation of sites. So this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I think it's a likely place because it is in a place where it would be in the confines of the area where it was. There's another place that they have outside that scope. It's a real nice, calm place to meditate. I don't think it's what it is. I think the stones days later, but it's a nice place to just kind of meditate. This is actually inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Like I said, the other grave is gone. It's somewhere in there, but this is the grave such as the grave of Jesus would have been. But that's the basalt stone. It would have been something like that, and then a stone rolled in front of it. But that grave is empty today, I believe.